Welcome everyone to CG Seminar 345, and we're delighted today to welcome Susan Robertson, who's going to talk about knowledge societies, higher education and political cleavages, paradoxes in search of explanation. So a lot of territory will be covered today. Well, it's a pleasure to introduce a good colleague, long-standing colleague and friend, Susan L. Robertson, a professor of sociology of education and co-editor-in-chief of the Globalization Societies in Education, a most important journal, a most innovative journal in our field of international higher education studies. And Susan is currently an affiliated lecturer at the University of Cambridge, where she was until recently head of faculty. She's also a distinguished professorial fellow at Aarhus University in Denmark, an adjunct professor at OISE in Toronto in Canada, and distinguished professor at the Beijing Institute of Technology. She writes about the political economy of higher education, including global regionalisms, notable book on regionalisms, 2014, I think, Susan, and multilateralism and transformations of the state and governing. So at this point, let me hand over to you, Susan. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Simon, for that lovely introduction. And let me just bring up my slides, and here we
can see those. That's good.
Oh, all good. Okay. So thank you for the lovely introduction and also the opportunity to speak with all of you today. I'd like to also just say that there are more slides that I'm going to speak to, or then I'm going to speak to in the slide deck. And that's in part because I know individuals who can't make it today are actually looking out for the slides and so on. I've spoken to this topic a couple of times. One and a wonderful invitation to speak at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in Athens as part of a series. And toward the end of last year, the Thesis 11 annual lecture. And it's an important topic, essentially, because for the moment, also, what we've actually got is a whole range of both economists, sociologists, and political scientists who are thinking out loud about fundamentally fairly significant shifts in and around what we might call politics, the rise of populism, and I'm going to point out some of the kind of paradoxes. Thumbnail sketch of it all is that what might have been the old left that had typically voted more or less, this is cleavage theory fundamentally, the old left would have pretty much always preferred so-called left-leaning Labour, Labour-oriented or democratic, if you're in the United States, political parties, and the right, so these are the more educated, so the left, these are the working class, less levels of education, voting to in and against Labour parties, and the more well-educated have historically voted for Republican conservative. And what the political scientists can actually see is a series of kind of shifts that are moving in different directions. And what I want to do today is, in half an hour, is explore the kinds of accounts that are actually on the table, and also to problematize some of those accounts. So I'm going to quite quickly go through a fairly simple early account that's emerged to describe really kind of populisms. So the rise of authoritarian populisms, and here it's kind of being built to the so-called nativist, but This is a fairly simple story, this one, and it's Bovens and Willie, who published a book quite widely read in the UK on what they call education cleavages. And this is a kind of binary. So the first part of that binary is the better educated you are, we can tell you what papers you read, where you go on holidays, where you live, that kind of issue. And if we go to the alternate that they actually put up, is here it would describe pretty much what they would then think of is right, authoritarian leaning nativist, voting for anti-immigrants and so on. So here what you can see are individuals who are not as well educated in their view, so just to 15 to 17, but broadly 15, where you take holidays and so on. Now, the issue that I have with this is that it is pretty much kind of intimating that this first group here, the so-called cosmopolitan lot, they're well educated, and they are, and this is the bit that's important, they are the product of the Knowledge Society project. So Bell and others and we see governments get behind the development of the so-called knowledge economy. But explicitly, Bovens and Willie, and we'll see Piketty is doing the same kind of thing. Another writer that we'll look at briefly, Kashelt and Rain. All of them have bought into the idea that this voting behaviour and the shifts to left and right are the consequences of the emergence and development and realisation, the transition to a knowledge society. And I'm using knowledge society explicitly because that's the language that they're using. Okay, so Piketty also, in a monster book on that he's put out, Capital and Ideology, more recently, is drawing, like Bovens and Willie, on quite large data sets and puts this kind of an account on the table. So for Piketty, he's drawing on data that comes from Western Europe, from post-socialist countries, and from the Latin American world. And argues to, so buys into the knowledge society argument, asks questions about the rise of the shift to left, right, and the so-called authoritarian populist kind of vote, and then puts on the table this kind of binarized a Brahmin left. So now you're quite well educated, so you're high income, but high income, it's over here. What we've got is your social kind of liberal lot, where you've got a high income, so I'll just stay here, your high education, low income here, and your merchant right, which is your high income and potentially low to maybe medium kind of levels of income. And what he's arguing here is that income and education, those two things, basically define now the way in which votes are being cast in the ballot box. For Piketty, what he's identifying is really the top 10% of those who are well educated. And we'll begin to see when we look at the census data in the UK that in fact actually the top 10% in no way captures really the levels of education in the case of the UK, which is at least 3 times that. So what we've got is Piketty buying into the education and income is now defining our voting behaviour. Knowledge society is the consequence. So the well-educated have become much more cosmopolitan, more worldly, more global, more open-minded. That's the kind of way that story actually goes. And your inclination to vote to the left in part might be motivated then by your lower levels of income and a sense that you've actually lost out on the education race. Kitchelt and Rame, who are US-based scholars, Kitchelt's been doing quite a lot of this kind of work for some time, complicates things a little bit in the sense that they begin to develop some dimensions around both income and education. So for income, we can have those who are more progressively oriented toward the redistribution versus more conservative. And if we look at education, levels of education, there are those who are more liberal, perhaps more progressive in their views about societies versus those who are much more authoritarian. They again buy into the knowledge society. This is what they're arguing. It emerged these kinds of world views and voting behaviour emerge out of the transition, as they would describe it, from industrial to knowledge societies. But they also take issue with Piketty, who is much more simple in the way in which Piketty is making these kinds of claims, and actually arguing there's quite a rump in the middle where essentially you're quite well educated, but you could also be moving in different kinds of directions. So there's the kind of middle class that Piketty is not doing anything much about. And it's so we've got the old core groups, they've switched sides fundamentally, but it's the middle, the so-called middle class, not at the top, not at the bottom, that basically then would form these cross-pressure party groups. Now, it becomes important when we think of education. So what Piketty is doing is arguing, and then I'll kind of unpack this a little bit, that if this is the case, then more higher education, if we see well-educated, the well-educated moving to the left, then it would then follow logically that we should be promoting access to more higher education. And that's what Piketty actually does in Capital and Ideology. They all draw on also Daniel Usch's work, where Usch is actually saying, well, we shouldn't be surprised that there are different voting patterns emerging out of linked to education, because what we see fundamentally taking place is a transformation in the nature of social class and the categories, the occupational categories. And Usch is used a lot to, by all of these writers, to then, think through and see if they can actually justify why we see these kinds of shifts. So keep holding on to this idea that the logic for Piketty is that more education actually will then generate potentially a kind of a revolutionary strategy of some kind to the left. And he's important because he's the advisor to many left-oriented governments, or at least in the case of Greece, political parties that are kind of angling for dominance in terms of political power. Now, Daniel Usch does this, though. What he says is if he maps across into these different categories, people who now often in typically, service-based jobs and so on, puts primary teachers, by the way, into a semi-professional class, which I'm sure they're not going to be happy about, and actually argues that these more, person-to-person kinds of activities logically result in the fact that you have greater empathy, toward others. And so this would actually, these interpersonal work logics would actually mean that you are more oriented to people, their circumstances, and you're likely to vote left. So in summary so far, the argument is that the rise in different levels of higher education are the consequence of the transition to a knowledge society. It transforms values, political alliances, and voting behaviour. And that these then map onto transformations in the nature of occupations and so on. Now, I've mentioned that. Now, the issue here is that if we start to look at it really closely, the first claim I want to make is that they all assume a kind of a teleology toward the knowledge society. Okay? But many of us that have been working in higher education studies of political economy know that, in fact, actually it's an economy that's under construction. There's no obvious teleology here. What you will begin to see, actually, as I unpack it a little bit more, the assumption that the better educated you are, the more cosmopolitan, open-minded, and so on in your worldview is actually deeply problematic. And there's research out there to show, in fact, that some of that is actually the case. Usha's problematic. Usha's claims that actually people who work in the people-to-people industry are also working in the state, and therefore it's important for them to actually have forms of state redistribution and so on. But if you look at a whole raft of societies that have embraced neoliberalism, what you found is many of these occupations are part of the privatised social policy landscape, run through private NGOs, all kinds of the corporate world, and so on. The third issue so far is that higher education is black boxed and placed beyond ideology. And as we look at the case of England that I know pretty well here, what we see is that, in fact, actually it is, and here I'm drawing a lot on the wonderful work of Vincent Carpentier, a fabulous piece of work he did looking at differentiation. And you can begin to kind of trace the contours of actually growing inequalities, neoliberal meritocracy, new forms of imperialism, and as actually we export outward, and forms of precarity and militarism even emerging in the higher education world, as education itself is actually brought forward and into the front stage, as Luxemburg and Nancy Fraser would actually describe it, no longer playing the role only of social reproduction. It's actually bang in the middle of production itself through the services sector. So first question is, the assumption that left and right actually mean the same thing. And we might actually say, if we were to look at the Labour Party here versus the Conservatives, it's sometimes quite difficult to make a clear distinction. And John Gray, actually speaking on the weekend on Point of View, actually made that kind of statement as well. What are the social relations? We'd have to ask the higher education sectors we're actually looking at, because it would strike me actually that these are empirical questions. In other words, more education, when that more education has actually been pretty much kind of commodified or market created, and we're talking about commodities here, more of that actually would be deeply problematic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just quickly lean into Rosa Luxemburg's work and her insights. She's departing from, in conversation with Marx here, in terms of accumulation, and her conversation in her wonderful work on the accumulation of capital, which she published in the very early 1900s. She in fact actually takes issue with Marx, and she makes the case for the fact that the accumulation process will, almost in the way she actually both understands it, needs to internationalize in some way. And so we get then forms of imperialism out to parts of the world that have been not yet commodified or caught up in market making, or into sectors actually, such as education, if we were to move it forward. I must say, actually, reading some of the material, the professors were actually regarded by Marx as essentially parasitic, which I thought was really kind of interesting. Luxemburg is also departing. She's in conversation and serious conversation with Lenin, because for Lenin, essentially, it's the vanguard that would actually drive some kind of revolutionary strategy. And in her view, essentially, it is the engagement with what she would describe as the masses. And what she doesn't mean by that is the proletariat. What she means is you would mobilize the people more broadly around pointing out the ways in which the accumulation process itself is predatory in that sense. And perhaps just to make a final point, what she's always looking at is the way in which a dual process is at work, an internal and an external, an inside and an outside. And more recently, Nancy Fraser has been describing this as a front stage, backstage. So the backstage, for example, engages in social reproduction. Front stage is actually the world of production, but each of them need each other. So if you think of it as a kind of almost a figure of eight, it kind of but thought of as a whole, that's how that system kind of works. So if we look at the case of the UK here, we would have to then basically say what we're looking at here is not the kind of education that would deliver some kind of revolutionary strategy if we begin to trace out the contours of the policy making that's taken place over a period of time, just over 2 decades, in the making of what Colin Lees would call a market society. This is work that I've been doing with Michele Martini, where we've actually been taking each of the big reports and using network text analysis to be able to distill what we would describe as the sort of the orders of discourse. So we start with the Deering review over here, essentially trying to problematize and open up access, formation of human capital. The Sainsbury review here, which essentially puts universities on notice around the development of the knowledge economy, innovation, entrepreneurs, and so on. The Brown report here, where essentially it's how to now bring students in as fee-paying and change and create a market, but essentially success as a knowledge economy. Here what you'll see fundamentally is that the idea of the university has now disappeared. And this is Joe Johnson's report. But now what we've got is providers. So some limited access to the system here by the alternate providers. And now the idea of the alternate providers has been collapsed, and actually what we have is now simply the provider. Universities, alternate providers, now universities, and so on. And there's some 700 to 800 of them. And the globalization, your centre, Simon, has done quite a lot of really important work around that. Okay? So if we kind of keep this in view, what we've got is the progressive creation of both an internal or local market, so now commodifying a sector that had been decommodified, and expanding that sector as well through exports. So rather than knowledge society, the making, the production, the producing, the creating, the instituting, the embedding, or any of those kinds of words, a la Polanyi, would be a better account of actually what has gone on in that world, which then raises all sorts of interesting questions around this, you know, the cosmopolitan, knowledgeable, well-educated, and so on, tolerant toward others. In fact, we'll start to see that Jonathon Mijs raises some interesting, shows interesting data where in fact actually levels of tolerance amongst the highly educated are somewhat problematic. It's these kinds of figures that tell you, in fact, this is not the education that Piketty is actually thinking about. This is a full-blown export sector that generates significant returns. And we could run probably a fairly similar argument. And I could see Gavin Moody was in the audience, Australia, for instance. So it generates significant export income, and keeping this as part of a foregrounded capital accumulation process becomes important. Etienne Balibar has most recently, a wonderful French theorist, has gone back into work he's done on political economy, done much more work more recently around borders and so on. And in a beautiful piece of work is starting to think along with people like Wolfgang Streeck, how do they think about education itself in different ways? So rather than stay with this, Marx kind of would have put sectors like education, beyond the world of production. If we draw education into capital accumulation processes, what that also means that we also need to think about and theorize in different ways and diagnose differently the current state of capitalism, advanced capitalism, capital accumulation. And there's a very interesting debate going on right now in the New Left Review that Morozov and others, as they're kind of also trying to think about the rise of techno-feudalism and so on. But some of these writers, Balibar too, are kind of engaging in this rethinking of what is it that we're looking at in contemporary capitalism. But this is Balibar also drawing on Gary Becker's work, where Becker essentially argues that making credit available then broadens the range of possibilities for individuals without patrimony. And this is then presented as a democratic corrective, to quote. Democracy then goes along with mass indebtedness. So democracy, giving everyone access to higher education through credit, he argues, is not just an ideological masquerade, but an effective instrument to include a growing number of people in the process of valorizing or valorization through training. And we can see this here. So thanks to the work of Vincent, it's a beautiful paper if you're listening, Vincent. If we're looking at fee paying, for example, this is really significant. Quite a lot of socializing of the cost of research, which many of the corporates would be accessing here, as some of the preliminary research, let's say the theoretical and earlier research, and the cost of that research has been carried by universities, and then we get spin outs and so on, companies being developed, etc., etc. And this particularly, I mean, it's this line that you're kind of looking at here in terms of the proportion of income coming into the universities. And social sciences particularly are the big fee generators for universities because they're low cost and high tariff. Now, actually, this has generated a very high level of education, and this is the office, the census that came out about a couple of months ago, that in fact actually those with level 4 and above, so that's with a university degree and above, essentially this is around just short of about 35%, which is a really high level. But if you were to go to London, it doubles. It's close to 60% of people with a qualification. So while Piketty is actually identifying the top 10%, he's really only talking about people with broadly kind of PhDs here, when he's talking about the highly educated and the data sets that he's actually drawing on. But what we do see is this expansion of access to credit actually generates an extremely high level of indebtedness, and these are the more recent figures that are something like 201 billion, which is an astonishing figure. What drives all of this, as you all know, and so I'm just speaking to everything that you know here now, but not to more, if I'm talking to political scientists and sociologists and so on more broadly, they've got a kind of an underwhelming understanding of some of the developments that have been taking place in the sector. This is, as we then kind of set up this race of what I've called vertical vision, the top and the bottom, and the sense of the effective dimensions of when things feel as if they're falling apart and falling away, you're nevertheless caught up and are kept in that race. The so-called engines of anxiety, says Epsilon and Sauder. here, or most recently in the Theory, Culture and Society. Look out for this lovely article by Ibled, where she does a rereading of Hayek's corpus of work. And essentially for Hayek, though he kind of says that this is not quite what he's doing, Hayek is absolutely running this kind of Darwinian race, and the argument is that it smacks of also eugenics. If you can't make it, if you're not productive, then essentially then you're basically essentially not valuable and not useful to the society. Now some of these elements that we begin to see, again, courtesy of Vincent's work here, high levels of differentiation now taking place in the sector. We can see actually where those who've never been to university end up. They'll end up in one of these bits of the differentiated sector that now include the for-profit or the old alternative lot who are offering degrees at a cheaper price. Just one figure, actually, there's double the number of Black, Asian, minority ethnic students in that sector doing things like law and so on, which will never ever be valorized in terms of, you know, being able to get the kind of salary that you would get from working in the law area and so on. So these are aspirational efforts on the part of families and individuals, and it parallels pretty much the kind of thing that was happening in the United States with the rise of the for-profits. We can actually then see too the way in which precarity is at work here. This is, these are very recent figures from UCU here. Oops, sorry, let me just go back. And I'm just about to kind of get to the end, but where in the teaching only contracts, you reduce the cost of actually what you're paying, you expand access, and those who have the luxury of doing research, this is a tiny percentage of increase across the sector. So the rise of precarity, 0 hours contracts. Playing into this, and more recently, is then as the sale of ideas and innovation and so on actually gets caught up in the vortex of all of this, is across a number of different countries, kind of anti-China, Australia, UK, the Netherlands, the United States, all kind of rounding on someone that might come from somewhere else that's going to steal research. So the National Cyber Security Centre essentially now has a checklist. Those who are heads of institution or heads of department have to engage any of their people who might be travelling into different parts of the world into an evaluation of either their research visit, and so on. So let me just, this is almost the last kind of bit of stuff, and then I'll draw it to a close. What we've also seen taking place, and this comes from Jonathon Mijs' lovely work, where he shows that the most unequal societies, okay, United States and the United Kingdom, on the survey work that which is the International Social Survey data that he reports on, that both the most educated and the least educated in these societies essentially agree or argue for meritocracy. In other words, your success in getting there, or those who get there and are successful, it is entirely a consequence of their effort that then is realised in terms of a good salary or not getting ahead and so on. And so the work I've done with Michele Martini, a paper that had come out in Sociology Compass more recently, actually we chart and we show the way in which discursively we can actually see the effort through policy to create a putative level playing field. So if everyone's equal, if you get ahead, then you get ahead on the basis of your effort and nothing else. The more equal societies have a completely different kind of narrative. So the increase in the belief in meritocracy, it kind of dipped here, but this is up moving up. And we provide the empirical evidence for Joe Littler's claim of what we're seeing here is neoliberal meritocracy. And we can actually show the way in which it's come through the various kinds of policies that we're able to, those same policies that we were tracing earlier. This is from a paper that actually we're having difficulty publishing. If a publisher wants to get at this, what we're trying to do is look at the way in which modalities of the private are actually shifting and over time. So the early Washington consensus, where we saw privatizing taking place in and of here, but the more recent kind of renditions here, which would actually be the kind of thing that Balabar is trying to put his finger on. The way in which we get new kinds of viewing yourself as human capital. So this is a very different kind of social ontology here than what we might have even seen kind of back down here. And for Balabar, for instance, arguing the case that what we see is what absolute capitalism and total subsumption. In other words, you yourself are a piece of capital, and this is kind of aided by what is kind of being called the new Washington, the Wall Street consensus, which to a large extent is replacing the Washington consensus. So I'm just going to go to the conclusions now, and we can open this up for questions. So the argument here, I think, that I've been making is that, in fact, to make these kind of assertions, all countries moving to become knowledge or more open-minded cosmopolitans on as a consequence of knowledge society kind of transitions. My view is that's deeply problematic. And in fact, actually, any of this requires empirical investigation. And the English case, and I'm using the English case, is a good example of when you look closely at it, it's not quite what we're actually seeing. That in fact, actually both the internal and the external, the expansion of markets. And in fact, I've just finished a paper most recently with John Wu, where we're actually looking at a new form of imperialism that actually sits on old forms of imperialism kind of taking place and at work, and a ramping up, particularly from 2021, of the market making problems, international market making, and so on. Using the work of Luxembourg, what we can see then is that we need to kind of look at these as kind of inside outside. So bringing education, higher education to the front stage, away from its so-called social reproduction role here, kind of needs to be theorized. And we're kind of, and I'm kind of using bits of Balabar's work to try and some work from Wolfgang Streeck to begin to think about these kinds of social relations and processes at work. And essentially, would we, let's say this is the final kind of question here, if access to UK higher education means that what we're accessing, we shouldn't be surprised at this, a neoliberal meritocratic entrepreneur, is that the kind of educated individual that in fact actually is going to be the vanguard of a revolutionary strategy? And my sense is actually no in there. So I'm just going to, I think that's it. So I'm just going to say thank you, and I'm going to stop sharing, and back to you, Simon.
Well, thanks, Susan. There's a great deal there. I'm having chats with people in the chat about that, about the richness of it. So we take it then that the knowledge society, the knowledge economy are organising concepts which conceal more than they reveal, that they're not the holistic transformation of society or education along the lines presented, but there's something else going on, that they are, if you like, Trojan horses for a more direct value creation role for education within the circuits of capital. Is there anything else that education is doing apart from that apart from that, and perhaps moulding subjects as well for the capitalist economy. I mean, creation of value through things like the export sector.
Okay.
And
and what I haven't done, and in fact, actually, but that was in the interest of time. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that there's been the kind of political activity, strikes and so on in the sector and across different sectors and so on. And, you know, let's say universities like Cambridge, historically, they were not known to get to the barricades, you know, when student fees and that were coming in, but they have definitely been very active politically. As part of the UCU strikes and things like that. So one of the things that we might also begin to see, because none of this is kind of totalizing in that sense. And that's the problem with the earlier account. Being able to kind of distill and see and experience the kinds of things that we're looking at also generates, you know, resistances. Individuals who begin to ask questions, and certainly some of the precarious labour, for instance. Or if we look at the Brexit vote, for instance, Danny Dorling would actually be able to show you that in the southeast, which was supposedly that you had quite well off middle class, or at least upper working class, but middle class individuals who feel that they've actually lost out. They were promised something in return for investing in education, and they don't have the kind of job. But that vote's gone in several different directions. So I don't view human agents as simply kind of dupes. We can kind of see patternings here, but active subjects who are also aware of the kind of contexts and the politics of the societies that they're actually living in.
Now I'd like to bring in Miguel Lim at this stage. Miguel, are you there, please?
Hi, yes. Hi, hello, Susan. Thank you so much. I mean, there was so much in there. So just to connect a little bit to the earlier ideas, a little bit earlier in the presentation, a little bit about the political left and the political right, also dealing with the title of the presentation. So something I was reflecting on, as you said, right, like, the assumption that you know, that more higher education leads to like greater support or greater formation of the you know, of the vanguard of the left. And so I was just trying to understand this concept of overeducation, especially in the light of what I saw as a kind of like political or growing political consensus at that point, and it still exists today in Denmark across the, I would say, not necessarily the far left, but the center right and the center left, that there's an overinvestment in higher education in Denmark, where that seemed to cross a little bit these this political divide, and obviously that might have had to do with the sense that Danish higher education is extremely generous, the sense that people were taking too long to finish their higher education studies. So, I mean, I think the sense that it bled from an economic concept, overeducation was not good for the economy, but became a kind of like political consensus that is having political effects in Denmark, which I thought was really interesting, given that there was a well-known societal commitment to being a knowledge economy, the sense that Denmark is a high tax, high value economy, and therefore needs to produce economic goods. But where the center right and the center left, and I would say like even the parts of the left have accepted this kind of policy trend towards the limiting or the reduction of investment in higher education in particular. And I wondered whether that that's something that you see in other places. Obviously in the UK, sorry, in England, this new Labour target of meeting 50% in education has, quote unquote, come and gone, but we haven't yet had that debate, and that debate is moving towards better access rather than a sense of over-education, although I know that in some parts there is already a claim that England is overeducated in terms of its higher education sector. Anyway, thank you very much, Susan, and great to hear all of those ideas. I probably still have to digest quite a bit of what you've said.
So thank you. I mean, Well, it's interesting, isn't it, this idea of over-education, because in fact it actually only to some extent makes sense if we're thinking about potentially kind of efficiencies, you know, and you know, we could just remind ourselves that there was a long and strong and ongoing discourse around, you know, learning societies, for example, the idea that you would actually be learning, you know, potentially kind of through your lifetime. But the minute you frame it in efficiency terms, then what you're doing is doing really, you know, what Becker was actually doing. You know, how efficient is it to provide that same kind of education, for example, to the so-called, you know, rump versus the elite. That was what Becker was doing when he was kind of writing at that particular point. And it would strike me that we would, and well, in places, there's a body of work around, you know, access to higher education. You might limit that, and you might talk about it as a coordination good. And here I'm thanking Jean Wu, who's drawn that kind of argument to my attention, and particularly in authoritarian societies where you don't want too many people to be too well educated because they begin to also ask questions. So you might limit the ways in which access to higher education in those kinds of societies, or what kind of higher education in those kinds of societies, and so on. So I'll just kind of leave it there in the interest of time and go perhaps back to you, Simon, for another question.
Yeah, Peter Lee. Pete Lee, are you there, please?
Yes, I am.
Excellent, far away.
Great. Well, wonderful presentation, Susan. I have a question. How do you feel about the machine learning boom, you know, chatbots, ChatGPT, and so forth? Has it affected your theory?
You know, I've been actively engaged with people in conversations around that. And I mean, so one way you might want to think about it is that actually, you know, the so-called knowledges out there that have all been kind of harvested, I must say, at great cost to the planet, because actually to keep processing any of this stuff is monstrously expensive energy-wise. But so the question is here is, how can you attribute, for example, at an institutional level, authorship, particularly where students might, you know, essentially use this as a way of actually doing their assignments and so on. But there was also a really Adam Gopnik on Point of View on a Sunday morning. Kind of, he was in conversation with his daughter, who said, you know, this is the way, if you read them enough and look at them enough, and I've done some of my own kind of experimenting with it, you know, it's very formulaic, actually, you know, in summary. I mean, you can kind of see it at work, or you can ask questions, for instance, about what's the difference between, you know, epistemology, ontology, and that kind of stuff, and you get a fairly kind of prosaic, almost kind of classic textbook. And it looks backwards, it can't look forward. And I mean, I think it's an interesting kind of innovation. It actually, ChatGPT only kind of cuts off at 2020, doesn't it? So it's not working with contemporary knowledges kind of as they're in motion either. But I think, yeah, although essentially is that Google are kind of launching theirs, which is kind of real-time live data, that kind of thing. But I guess we've always had technological innovations, and where this one kind of hits the fan, I guess, is the issue around credentialism, and the way in which we distribute opportunities on the basis of credentials in that sense. And so is it the case that the knowledges that you are claiming in relation to credentials isn't quite your knowledge, but hey, that's probably, plagiarism's been around for many years anyway.
Well, if we had a ChatGPT in the audience, I would suggest that the ChatGPT prepares a question in the style of a CG webinar right now, because we need some more questions. But Let me bring in Gavin Moody. Gavin.
Well, greetings, Susan, and thanks for the talk. And I think thanks for the mention, because it stimulated some thoughts that are not very well formed yet. Thus far, we have been examining changes in political groupings in Western liberal democracies, which are also part of the imperialist global system. And thus we know that the UK, USA, Canada, Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand recruit a very high proportion of their international students from China and increasingly India, thus being yet another instance of Luxemburg's point. And hitherto, the colonized have maintained being kept in a subservient position, but no longer. And will the formerly internally generated changes that we notice with Trumpism and Brexit and the counter Macron demonstrations now be subject to exogenous change emanating from China and perhaps India? And will we have to start paying more attention to political groupings and perhaps cleavages in China, because that will start having an external effect on our groupings?
So a lovely question, and I would probably, a beautiful essay by one of my favourite authors, Joran Thurborn, in the New Left Review, where Thurborn also kind of takes issue with this kind of quite simplistic, almost understanding, particularly of Piketty. I mean, he kind of sees it as a lost opportunity, because what he argues and he demonstrates that there's many different kinds of cleavages in different kinds of societies. You might actually think of India and the caste system and so on. And that actually, or if we could go to parts of the Arab world where we've got different ways in which we see that cut between one thing and another, and so on. So that's the first reflection. Go off and have a look at that essay, 2021 actually. It's a beautiful read, and he provides lots of kind of evidence for some of the kind of problems of the Piketty kind of analysis. But the second thing I want to say, I've just finished a paper with John Wu, and what we're looking at is what kinds of forms of imperialism might we actually see at work if we were to look at, let's say, China versus China versus the UK. And what we've gone out to is the literature on imperialisms, and essentially Marxist is pretty much economic imperialism. That's the dominant kind of an account. And it's in conversation to some extent with notions of political imperialism there, which would be, essentially kind of expansion of empire, that kind of thing. But we've also proposed the idea of cultural imperialism in there as a third element, where what I think we can kind of see is an effort on the part of China to kind of extend out an alternate kind of way of thinking about the world. And we would only at the moment describe it as nascent at best. and it's certainly not economic imperialism in that sense either. And I'm happy to send you a copy of that that paper. But we're kind of we're trying to expand the kind of conceptual grammar that we're using to try and think about the sector that many of us are kind of interested in and working on, where essentially, you know, Luxemburg's writing 100 years ago, Marx, you know, not far off 200 years ago, the kind of concepts that we need to understand the kind of contemporary world, global in that sense, which Luxemburg kind of recognized as a world ordering. That was her particularly, unlike to a large extent, I think, Lenin. But at the same time, but Luxemburg's work needs kind of renovating, adding to, and they had zero to say about education in that sense. In fact, interestingly, it's a little kind of footnote. Luxemburg was furious that she had to go off and teach. In the end, she enjoyed it, and it was one of the kind of the workers' academies in Berlin there that was quite important for then thinking about how she actually just made some money in order to live. But I guess my comment here really is that I think our job really in our analysing of higher education is that we've got to be exploring or putting on the table a conceptual vocabulary that enables us to engage with and think about geopolitics, geoeconomics, and particularly so in the light of the kind of account that I've actually put on the table. Because if we don't do this, what you get is, I'd probably say, a very poor rendering of the kind of thing that we've got with Piketty. And Piketty is important and powerful. I mean, he's in there, he was advising Corbyn, he was advising Bernie Sanders. So we need many of us to kind of get in there to do the kind of work that I know, Gavin, you've actually been engaged in, and many on this webinar actually also engaged in as well.
Yeah, Susan, we are getting to the end, but in the usual manner of this, people are coming forward late. So what I'm going to do is bring in 3 brief questions, colleagues, and give Susan a final reply, and that will close the webinar. And the first person will be Olga Munn. Olga.
Hello. I'm a doctoral researcher in the department. I had a quick question, and perhaps a naive one. Your lecture was very rich, but in terms of the practicalities, I wonder what we as higher education researchers can do, maybe learning from the colonial approaches, and it's in anticipation of the CIS theme of protests and dissent next year that you'll be chairing. So what revolutionary capacity do universities have if they're so deeply embedded in these racial capitalist structures globally, right? And of which, unfortunately, Oxbridge, we are at the heart of it by exploiting international student fees and this sort of ideology. So I wonder, do we need new concepts? Or maybe we already know enough and we can actually start changing something here at the core of the global North institutions. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Olga. And hold your reply, Susan. I'll just bring in the other 2. Ron Barnett.
Hello, Susan. Thank you very much for your talk again, very rich. And I'm afraid my question is going to be a reiteration of what Olga has just said, but I'll just put it in my way. It's a normative question. Assume a higher education in a liberal democratic society educates 50% of the young people, and assume that there is some link to liberal sentiments amongst those graduates. What responsibilities and what possibilities might there be for the higher education sector in society?
Hold your reply again, Susan. We've just got one more. Soman Chattopadhyay from Delhi. Soman.
Yeah, I must thank Professor Martinez for giving me the opportunity Susan, a very rich lecture, excellent lecture. I was thinking in the in our Indian context, it's so diverse and is a huge disparities and so divided. What role education would play, higher education would play in self-formation if we control for three factors? One is the public-private divide. Second is the distribution of income and distribution of educational attainment within the population. And third is the general and vocational divide within the education sector. Thank you.
Susan.
So just let me take your Simon's kind of question, the last question kind of first. And I mean, precisely from what you've just described, that in fact, actually, I mean, Piketty's analysis in no way kind of grasps something of the complexity and the diversity of, let's say, higher education in India, different kinds of institutions, research centres, that kind of thing. I mean, if we look at, I would probably want to say, look to some extent, look at the success at one level that Jonathon Mijs's account is presenting us with, that in those more unequal societies, and we shouldn't be surprised, but those more unequal societies, that there's been an upturn in meritocratic discourse. Okay, in other words, you justify the fact that you've got ahead on the basis of your own individual effort, because and it's your effort, as they would describe it in the survey, that in fact actually is the return. So there's no accounting for different forms of capital that might have assisted you. The more equal societies offer you a structural account. They will say that people who got ahead actually have got different kinds of resources and so on. So what we can actually see across the work that Mijs is kind of presenting us with is those societies that are more equal actually offer you can put on the table a less individual and a more structural account. And so that gives us one clue. And I would say the kind of thing that Wolfgang Streeck has constantly been pointing to, the shift back toward, let's say, a tax state. And it is something that Piketty is talking about, because what we can see is the self-formation, let's say using those two different more versus less equal societies, self-formation in those different societies is different in that sense via higher education, in which case what we're trying to do is, and this is where it would accord with what Piketty is saying, redistribution, so tax justice, for example. So this is what the kind of things that we can actually do. CEIS, come back to your comment, Olga, over the course of that week, and it's deeply controversial that we are holding that conference in Florida. But our view is essentially we can either just go away and pretend that DeSantis is not there, but look at the kind of policies he's got on the table for the higher education world. Get rid of diversity, you can't have a critical race theory on the curriculum, etc., etc., etc. So we are going there, okay? And across the course of the week, we want a whole series of difficult conversations to take place to do with different forms of justices. You know, they can be knowledge, epistemic, they can be to do with tax and redistribution issues. And really just as a kind of a last plug there, the kind of manifesto, really, I'd probably say that Nancy Fraser's actually got on the table in her book called Cannibal Capitalism. That in fact, actually, it's not just time's ticking, it's time's pretty much up. And if we want a more just institution, then we've got to work hard at the diagnosis. So this is essentially, it takes me back to Piketty. That diagnosis is not the right diagnosis, in my view. Essentially, to not problematize higher education is to basically not see it as part of the problem in particular countries, not everywhere. I'm not making that case. And if then that's the case, then what we've got to do is work pretty hard to look at the ways in which we unpick 20 to 30 or 30 to 40 years of the ways in which we've organised our institutions to generate, you know, precarity, 0 hours contracts, that kind of thing. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Grateful, thanks, Susan. There's more, of course, to be said, as is always the way with the rich presentation. Rich is the word which people have used a lot, and wonderful and inspiring is appearing in the chat as well. So well done today, and you've opened up so much, I think, in terms of available knowledge, available interpretations, which people will dip into through the YouTube videos. Colleagues, our next webinar is on Thursday. Of course, we are coming to the 30th of March, first quarter of the year, and we'll be in South Korea. Hunwee Cho, who's a visiting scholar at Oxford at the present, but he's a senior official in the Department of Education in Korea, South Korea, is going to talk about understanding higher education policies in South Korea, guiding perspectives, historical context, and policy problems of the government. That'll be a very well-informed presentation by an insider, and we look forward to sharing it with you. Thanks again, Susan. We obviously, every time you're on the webinar, it's a valuable experience for all of us, and we welcome you back as soon as possible. Thanks to everyone. Thanks for all of those who asked questions and took part in the chat discussion. And all I can say, I think, at this point is thank you and bye for now.
Thanks so much, Simon.